Good evening. Let's talk tonight about a way that Ukraine could win this war. There has been a lot of information over the last 2 months since the Ukrainian offensive took place on the 4th of June, indicating that the offensive is not going well and that slowly the Ukrainians are losing men and equipment in large numbers. There are reports of 30 or more tanks having been destroyed over the last 2 months. Tens of thousands of men allegedly reported, admittedly by Russian sources, but reporting that have been the number of losses of Ukrainians. Then there are corroborating statements from Ukrainian prisoners of war, men who have been captured or where reports have been intercepted in Ukrainian channels talking about large losses. Some battalions talking about after battling losing more than half of the members of their battalion. These reports are becoming more and more common. The Russian Ministry of Defense is making many reports about them identifying constant resupply of Ukrainian battalions. And they're reporting that they believe the nature of them is starting to change. Many of them are reservists now. So the conventional approach for Ukraine is finding hard going at the moment. In the last 2 months and almost 3 months now, by Friday of this week, we'll be up to the 3rd month of the offensive. There have been only insignificant advances and recapture of land made by the Ukrainians, primarily in the southern Donetsk and Zaporozhye region, and in the northern regions, getting up to the Kharkiv and Kupiansk area, there have been Russian advances, and perhaps the net in square kilometres captured would be very similar. So the conventional methods are failing, but there has to be a way for the Ukrainians to see a successful campaign here. And I've had something niggling in my mind for some time relating to how this could happen, what could be done. So for me, for Ukraine to find a way to be successful, let's first of all define what that success might look like. And here what I think we are talking about is success would, and for those of you who are just listening and not viewing now, I'm showing a map of Europe and zooming in on Ukraine. Success would be for Ukraine to be able to capture Crimea. So Crimea here, if Ukraine were able to assume control over Crimea by cutting Russian access to Crimea, then Ukraine would have found themselves a large and powerful bargaining tool. Even if control of Crimea by the Ukraine were only temporary and only to last for a period of weeks, that may be long enough for negotiations to commence. But the question becomes, how does Ukraine assume control of Crimea? The last few months have shown the ineffectiveness of the Ukrainian offensive, and this has come down to a couple of reasons. One of them is that there is a lack of air superiority. So the Ukrainians are not able to leverage their remaining fighter jets, their attack helicopters, in the same way that the Russians are able to do so. So we have this situation where the Russians are able to drop Fab 250, 500, Fab 1000 bombs onto the Ukrainian front lines. We have reports of the Ka-52 attack helicopters operating relatively unmolested in both the Zaporozhye region and up in north near Kupiansk at the moment. And very few reports of successful use of air power by the Ukrainians. And in fact, there have been many reports over the last 3 months of the loss of Ukrainian jets and aircraft. So a lack of air control by the Ukrainians is one challenge. Another is the air defense systems, which the Russians have in larger, more capable numbers, which are able to bring down not only Ukrainian jets and helicopters if they were to get too close to the front line, but also can take out numbers of missiles sent by the Ukrainians and larger drones sent by the Ukrainians. So that's a challenge Ukraine needs to find a way around. Artillery is the other challenge. Now, Ukraine is slowly losing the artillery battle of attrition here. It's been confirmed by no one less than Joe Biden, the United States President himself, and the United States Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, that the Americans have begun to provide Ukraine with cluster munitions because they have a shortage of the high explosive 155 millimeter rounds, which they would like to be providing. So on those fronts of air power, Ukraine is at a deficit, and artillery, they're at a deficit. Now, in some areas, there are heavy artillery battles going on, and definitely around the areas of Kleshchevka, to the south of Bakhmut or Artyomsk. Heavy fighting and artillery duels have been going on there. And there are day-to-day victories for Ukraine where they push back the Russian artillery, or we'll get video reports of Russian artillery pieces being destroyed. However, on the sum of things, I would say the amount of reports and video evidence that we get of Ukrainian artillery pieces is exceeding that of the Russian pieces being lost. So, conventional artillery warfare is a challenge for the Ukrainians. Air power is a challenge for the Ukrainians. So if Ukraine is going to win, if Ukraine is going to, going back to the map now, if Ukraine is going to be able to find a way to get down from where they are today, just south of Orikhiv, and make their way down to Tokmak. This is a distance of, let's see, what is that? Of 30 kilometers. Given that the Ukrainian front line is below Orikhiv now, they perhaps have 20 kilometers. They're on the eastern side of Robotny. They have perhaps 20 kilometers to Tokmak, and then from Tokmak, they would likely proceed down to Melitopol, which is another 45 kilometers or so, and then from Melitopol, it's a very short distance to get down to the coast, where then Ukraine would have effectively cut off Russian forces from getting access to Crimea from the Ukrainian side here. Now, there is still a challenge which we'll come to, which is the Kerch Bridge, but as we are already aware of from recent events, the Kerch Bridge is a target which the Ukrainians are able to reach out and touch if they choose to. But, okay, so the question is, how do the Ukrainians somehow overcome these challenges that they have? Well, my theory, first of all, I think an opportunity has been missed. And I think Ukraine are in a tough position here. Ukraine are in an existential threat, a position of real existential threat to their nation. Unfortunately, their backers, their suppliers in this conflict, the West, the European nations and the US, aren't yet in an existential conflict. And this is why we haven't seen NATO put boots on the ground, because at this stage, the risk-reward calculation done by the West is that they are better to fight the proxy war using Ukraine and avoid themselves getting into trouble, avoid the problems that this would bring for people like Joe Biden, who has an election coming up next year, if he has to deal with the front page and 6 o'clock news headlines of American boys being killed in Ukraine. If he can avoid that, he will. So while Ukraine is in an existential crisis, the West and their backers aren't. So this means that some of the options, which if the West was in an existential crisis, which could have been used or maybe used, haven't been. An example of this, which I've given before, is the Air Defender NATO air defence operation event that occurred a few months ago. Now, in this case, in Germany, Romania, moving this just on the map so we can see things. Poland, Romania, Germany was involved. Around these areas, there were 200 or more NATO jets flying in operations, and the operations were to mimic a NATO Article 5 emergency. So the situation where all NATO states would have to coordinate their forces in a combined attack against an enemy nation. Now, to me, if the West had been in an existential crisis, that would have been the first opportunity to change the balance of power. Those 200 jets, which were coordinated, being controlled, had their maintenance crews, supply, fuel arranged for them to be able to conduct these week-long exercises, could have been directed to the front line, coordinated with Ukrainian armed forces on the ground, and could have provided a one-time pulse or a push, which didn't happen, but could have been used to give some advantage to the Ukrainians. So that's an opportunity that was missed or was lost. But I just want to open our minds here and go for some whiteboard, blue sky thinking and not constrain ourselves with the traditional approach. Because I think if we consider just traditional warfare here and conventional warfare, then the Ukrainians are not in a position to win. So they need to be unconventional. Now, the biggest thing I feel we've learnt from this conflict, and the game changer that many people have spoken about, to me, clearly, is the use of drone technology. In particular, the smaller FPV drones. Those drones which are first-person view, the ones which are controlled by someone kilometres away from where the drone is operating, and the drone controller is able to see what the drone sees. So the drone controller uses either a phone display screen or a headset to view what the drone is doing. Now, these drones have already shown the way that they have made warfare asymmetrical and have been unconventional. We've seen multiple video confirmations of these Lancet or even smaller drones inflicting damage on outrageously expensive pieces of armoured equipment. And destroying them, being able to fly into on-the-ground trenches and command centres, the manoeuvrability and control afforded by these drones is well beyond anything that artillery can do. And in fact, in this war, there are reports from both sides that the precision ability of artillery has reached a level unseen before because of the use of these drones for targeting. It's now become very easy to take your best guess at your location for your first shot, perhaps based on anti-artillery radar, land that first shell and have a drone in the area, and it be able to then report back immediately on the correction required to allow you to then pinpoint exactly where you need your artillery to go. So, yeah, for me, if I was in control of the Ukrainian forces, and remember, just allow me this, so this is just a big thought experiment, but what I would be looking to do is to find a way to leverage that asymmetric power that drones have shown to give in the theatre of conflict. And so I imagine that if Ukraine were to assume this strategy and wish to try to win, then what they would need to do now is to go onto the defensive. stop the offensive as it is, because right now it appears to just be draining resources, both in men and materiel, for the Ukrainians. Instead, assume a defensive posture, allow them to save resources, build up the tanks, allow the Abrams, which have been sent to Germany and are being refurbished by the Germans, allow them to complete that and become available. Perhaps push for the F-16s and convince the Americans to allow some F-16s to come. Allow some time for some training of troops and that kind of thing. But most importantly, during this period of time, focus all the resources that the Ukrainians have upon the production of small drones. And drones with a couple of particular capabilities which are available now, but which weren't available at the start of this conflict. And that is the capabilities of swarming technologies with drones and AI detection of drones. So one of the challenges to the drones being used today, one of the challenges, particularly on ones which require communication from a commanding pilot, is that electronic warfare measures can be deployed to interfere with those communications. And this works on not only on drones but on radios. There are reports from Ukrainian commanders complaining that he's able to watch his troops walk out and he loses the ability to talk to them over radio after something like 70 meters. And by that time, the Russian electronic warfare has effectively rendered his radio communications useless. So things like that need to be considered about how you could get around them. Now, this is where the other capability, the AI capability, the artificial intelligence capability, the ability for a self-contained drone to, once it has perhaps begun its journey and lost the ability to communicate back to base, does not become effectively disabled. Instead, it moves to an autonomous mode where, based upon previous footage provided to it in a database and with a small machine learning language model applied and operational on the processor on the drone, is able to use the video imagery of the area that it's flying over to locate and determine where it is. Now, prior to perhaps 12 months ago, this type of capability existed in very high-end intercontinental ballistic missiles, when the range over which they were sent required them to have other abilities to target, but it was very expensive. Today, and the price of this is coming down by the day, today the ability to develop visual targeting systems that can fit onto drones, those small drones which then also carry a payload, an explosive payload, has become achievable. So if we were to imagine the Ukrainians wanting to make a drive down, going back to the map, from Robotny, here below Orkiv, down through Tokmak to Melitopol and to the Azov Sea, or perhaps even from driving across from Kherson, or from the reservoir of the Novokhovka reservoir, if once that ground dries out. If they were to do that today, and they've been attempting to do that, they're going to struggle. If, however, they changed tack and began to use swarms of drones. Now, when we're talking about swarms here, I'm not talking about 5 or 10 or 40. I'm talking about hundreds and thousands of drones launched simultaneously, following erratic paths down from, let's say, from Robotny, following a broad, erratic group of paths down, flying around where air defense is believed to be, or where air defense is identified, Sending in your drone swarms a combination of drones, some larger than others, which would be sacrificial drones, ones used to reveal the location of air defense systems, and then allowing those smaller, more maneuverable drones to then target those air defense systems themselves. So in effect, you would send out a swarm of autonomous or semi-autonomous drones along the pathway, flying erratic, hard-to-detect paths, flying at ground level. For those that remain in range to be able to be controlled by pilots, flying along whatever path you choose. I have seen footage, and this was in the early days of the war, where I watched from the view of a drone, a pilot launch his drone, fly it out over countryside, detect another troop, an armoured personnel carrier, fly the drone down and land underneath the armoured personnel carrier. Now, that kind of positioning, once an enemy position is located and identified, means that you can inflict quite a bit of damage on the ground, even if those are smaller drones carrying, for example, only the explosive power of a handheld grenade. If you have air defense systems, which the Russians will have many of them, from Robotny down to the coast, the Sea of Azov, those air defense systems have a limited number of shots that they can fire in any one particular time, and there will be limits upon how quickly they can be reloaded and restocked. So by effectively overwhelming the conventional tools of war, the artillery pieces, the air defense pieces, the mobile artillery, the tanks and entrenched positions, not with an overwhelming amount of force per se, but with a asymmetric, unconventional tactic that gives you some of what you were missing before. It gives you some air control. Now, it's not fighter jet air control suppressing activity in an area, but it is air control with your drones in the air. It gives you some ability back over artillery, as again, if you were to swarm areas where you believed artillery to be with tens or hundreds of drones, then even if 90% of those 100 drones are shot down, you've still got 10 getting through to attack that piece of artillery and take it out. Now, I'm sure some of you will think that this is just completely dreams and pies in the sky sort of stuff. I don't think it's too far away. I don't know if any of you have seen the footage of the large dragon drone swarm, which I think may have been in Singapore from a week or so ago. If you haven't seen some recent footage of drone swarm technology, go and Google it. It's mind-blowing. The graceful coordination of thousands of drones together to form shapes and operate in harmony is quite amazing to watch. There's another video that I saw not long ago of hundreds of drones laid out over a tennis court, I think it was, and simultaneously rows of them began to launch themselves into the air in coordinated flight. So those drones, that software exists to coordinate them to perform graceful looking maneuvers with lights and effectively look like next generation fireworks. Now, if those were all capable of carrying a grenade, 1,000 or so of those, and they were able to coordinate with one another, share information with each other, so if one detects a target, 5 of them could fly off to that target, the rest of them being aware of it, some of them keeping an eye on those and reporting back whether they were successful or if more drones needed to proceed to help address that target. I think very rapidly you see how that becomes tough to overcome unless your adversary has considered this option and has somehow worked out a means of defending against it. Now, there are conventional means. As I've said, there are electronic warfare measures in place. There is talk at the moment that the Russian army may have developed a way to disable Starlink communication. So Elon Musk, who has developed the Starlink satellite system, which provides internet coverage, I think, effectively all over the world now, as long as you have a Starlink device on the ground, due to the array of satellites that are in position around the Earth now, they can look down, see the Starlink receivers, and allow transmission of information. There's reports that the Russians have the ability now to counteract the Starlink systems. So if that is the case, then using something like that to provide directional communication and targeting to your drones may not be an option. And this is where, as I say, having existing pictures of the ground, which can be provided to an AI software and allow it to match the vision it's seeing with where it's intended to be targeted, giving it some autonomous ability to recognize targets, effectively say, once you are out of our area of control and into what is we're considering to be enemy territory, then anything you see in that zone that looks like a tank or looks like an armored personnel carrier or looks like a radar installation is fair game. It doesn't have to be perfect, and it would fail sometimes, and it would sometimes get things wrong and would take out a tractor instead of a tank. But if you are facing an existential crisis, I think you could live with the 90% that you might get right if you were to employ a tactic like this. Anyhow, this was a thought that's been interesting to me and rolling around in my head, and I imagine that soon we will see more drone technology. In a report from a week ago from the developer of the Lancet, they are talking about product 53, their evolved version of the Lancet. The Lancet has already been extremely successful in this conflict, and what they are suggesting is that it does have some swarming capability coming to it. That capability, which I believe would allow one Lancet to fly. And remember, these drones, they're termed loitering munitions. They will fly above a target and circle around and wait until they're told to attack. In this case, it appears as though the drones themselves may now be able to coordinate and command others to attack. So one drone may perhaps assume a higher elevation than the others and scan an area, identify a target, and then coordinate the other drones in the area to go and attack. Now, that's reportedly being developed in Lancet drones that are being produced now. So I think that I think that there is a chance. There is a very small window, and we're talking perhaps weeks or maybe months, but a very small window where a dedicated push could allow Ukraine to develop enough drone capability with enough unconventional functionality to support them in a push to try to counteract the deficiencies that the Ukrainians have in terms of artillery and air superiority. Okay, that's it for that big idea of mine for tonight. If you've made it this far, thank you very much for watching. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. And I am planning on putting together another video soon on what's happening in Africa, because I think that's going to play a large part geopolitically in what we'll be talking about for the next little while. All right, thank you. Good night.